Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Jacobin Talk. My name is Bhaskar Sankar. I'm the editor and publisher of Jacobin Magazine, and roughly 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, most weeks, we've been doing talks with a left-wing thinker on a hopefully interesting, engaging topic for around an hour. The talk lecture portion of it is normally 30 minutes, and we do a brief Q&A. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. I'll be interviewing Harvey J. Kaye on Thomas Paine, a figure that I think is close to the hearts of any leftist or radical anywhere in the world, but especially the Anglophone world. Harvey was a fan of our late friend, Michael Brooks. I actually just told him that the only book of his that I had read was a survey of British Marxist historians that he did in the 1980s. So he's definitely one of us. I think most people know his more recent work on FDR, which got a lot of attention, a lot of acclaim, The Fight for Four Freedoms. You might also know his work on Thomas Paine, but he's someone who's engaged very seriously with Marxist historians like Christopher Hill, E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm. And he's, like most historians on the left, has been able to really popularize his work, has been able to just write an incredibly clear prose and concision. You know, Marxist historians can do that well. Our economists and sociologists have equally valuable work, but often struggle in that regard. So we'd love to have historians on, and we're very happy to have Harvey today. We're going to do a little bit of an interview format. I'm going to ask a few basic questions on Tom Paine. Hopefully, if you have questions as well, please press like, press subscribe, put your comments in the chat box in YouTube or Facebook, and we'll try to get to it. I, in fact, read many of your comments recently, including the negative ones. That's why I endeavored to buy a microphone out of pocket, like $70. So please stop complaining about my sound quality. I probably will not improve my camera because that's more expensive, but the microphone, the audio part is fixed. So please press like and subscribe and leave your comments. And Harvey, I guess let's just start with it.
Or do I get to say hello?
Yes, please say hello.
Bhaskar, I got to tell you, it's a pleasure. Most people probably think we've already met sometime in the past. We haven't. This is our first meeting, and I can tell you, and I was not only a fan of Michael's, I'm immodest in saying that he used to say that he had 3 elder mentors, Adolf Reed, Richard Wolff, and myself. And I always used to say to him, because we had a deal that if I was in New York, I'd always come in studio. And I said, well, sometime please bring Bhaskar in so I can meet him. Well, Richard Wolff, so I can meet him, because in spite of knowing Richard for probably 30 years, he and I have never met. And in spite of my knowing of you for some years now, as I said, we've never met. I also want to make it clear, I'm a longtime subscriber to Jacobin, and I quite often try to tune in to these conversations. I watched Sean the other day on Debs. Turns out Sean and I will be on a panel soon on Debs on Ben Burgess's show. So it's a pleasure.
That's great. That's great. And by the way, I should say, to Professor Wolff's credit, he's one of the clearest of Marxist historians we've ever had as a popularizer and someone who really thinks about his audience as being a mass one and not just one within academia. But so let's focus the conversation to begin with on Paine. Then maybe using Paine, we'll get to some of these wider debates about the American Revolution, and maybe, hopefully by the end of this, we won't have a definitive answer, but maybe we'll have some more clarity on how we should view the American Revolution. I'll admit, I think later, to having some fairly contrarian takes about how the utility of it, but Paine, I think, is a figure that anyone across this debate can agree with. So can you talk a little bit about Paine's early life and formation to begin with? I think he ended up coming to America in fairly late in life in this 1770s, probably 1774, 1775, something like that.
Yeah, well, he was born in 1737 and he came over here the very end of the year 1774. So he's about 37 years of age, which in our contemporary terms would be approaching middle age. Um, Something I should make clear in case people don't quite realize it is he was probably the most fascinating political writer of that age, not only because of his specific arguments, but because he knew how to reach working people. He knew how to reach people of every social standing, and his commitment in particular was to working people. And the other thing of consequence is that he was the greatest radical of what was clearly a revolutionary age. He once said to someone, he took a certain pride in being involved in both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And we should also add, he was probably in many ways the godfather or father of the British struggle for democracy, decidedly the struggle for labor movement, the struggle of the labor movement, and in that sense of, in fact, British socialism. Now, so he was born in 1737, and it was a very modest family. I mean, I think the term often used rather humble beginnings. His father was a staymaker, which essentially was a corset maker, and it was particularly tough times for a corset maker during the 18th century. And nevertheless, his parents were fairly committed to getting him an education. And I mention his parents because it really does shape his thinking. His father was a Quaker, a member of the Friends. His mother was an Anglican. And it was really, truly, given the times, a mixed marriage. Anglicans were essentially full subjects of the British Crown. Quakers were tolerated at best. And that's in good part because in the 17th century English Revolution, the Quakers were one of the radical, if you like, dissenting groups of that time. The Friends, the Quaker community there, ostracized his father because he married an Anglican, in fact. But his father never gave up the identity of a Quaker and probably shaped Thomas Paine's own thinking about everything from politics to peace. His parents wanted him to get an education, not necessarily an elite education, a good education. His father didn't want him to learn Latin because he didn't want him to get involved too much with, if you like, the court, the crown. And what he did in school was he was in what we think of as an ordinary program. He couldn't stay in through his entire childhood. They pulled him out at the age of 13 and apprenticed him to his father. But it was the case that Paine was very much aware as he was growing up of the conflict among religious faiths. And this is really important. It comes out in his writing very early in the American Rebellion period. And it's imperative that we appreciate this question of interfaith contests and conflicts, because it may actually be one of the most fundamental elements that makes the American Revolution a revolution. So Paine had a very, very mixed career at best. After a few years of apprenticing with his father, he hated staymaking by most accounts. He actually ran off and he went to the seacoast and he enlisted as a privateer. A privateer is basically licensed piracy. It was the British Crown authorizing British sea captains to go out and attack enemy shipping. And then there was a deal where the captain and crew could divide the value of the cargo, and the ship itself that they took into their possession became the property of the crown. So Paine sailed for a year as a privateer, and he fought in battles. He was a very skilled man on board ship because he had been a staymaker, and thus he could repair sails. He probably also began to consider the nature of the universe. I say that here because at the end of a year, having made enough money, having had enough adventure, he left the ship. He did not sign on for a second time. He probably felt lucky he was still alive. And he went to London, and he spends almost a year in London, it's going to sound funny, educating himself in taverns and coffee shops, because the artisan class of England was not able to go to school as the more elite classes could. And they were autodidacts. And that autodidacticism involved setting up these kind of informal schools at night so that the finest of craftsmen and those who actually had renown could talk in anything from astronomy to the finest way of cabinetry. But fundamental, even in these kinds of settings, was natural philosophy, which is essentially the scientific method and also a very powerful force in religious terms and intellectual terms. You might say deism emerges. Deism is a belief in a creator, but a belief that the creator creates. And if indeed the creator is so perfect, then he or she, in this instance at that time, he didn't mess around with humanity too much and goes off and basically expands the universe. Well, Paine himself develops a deist understanding, okay? And he spends really whatever money he had, he spent the year going to these taverns and coffee shops and educating himself. Eventually, the money ran out, and he turns to stay making. He moves out outside of London. It really was a tough time, and he fell in love. And to add to the tragedy of the economically difficult times he experienced, his one and only love passed away in childbirth, which also made him very wary of involvements with women for fear that, like, I don't know, we have to read his mind, but the fact was he always had a certain kind of sensibility, a certain kind of attitude about gender equality, which may well have come about as a consequence of the difficulties that he had. So what it was is his wife, I'm stretching the story a bit, I hope you don't mind, but his wife was the daughter of an excise officer. Basically, that's a customs officer. And they had talked about the fact that Paine should abandon stay making in favor of taking the exam to become an excise officer. On the passing of his wife, he moves back to his parents' home in Norfolk, in a town called the village Thetford, and he studies for the exam. He passes it, and he is appointed an excise officer. An excise officer had a hell of a lot of responsibility along the seacoast because basically most villages welcomed the possibility of shipwrecks, because if it was a shipwreck, then the cargo would be available to locals. And it was not unusual for any number of villages to try to wreck ships in order to get the cargo. The excise officer was supposed to patrol the coast to limit that activity, and was also supposed to inspect the cargo. It so happened that at a certain point, he was accused of something called stamping. Stamping meant that he didn't properly inspect the cargo, and he was sacked. He was fired. Now, I make the longer story short, he actually petitions for reinstatement, and after a few years' time, he is reinstated, which leads to the conclusion that he was probably framed and not necessarily guilty of the stamping. Now, this is a real test for him. 3 years, he's essentially unemployed. He spends time tutoring the children of middle-class families. He gets involved in preaching at Methodist gatherings. He basically is living in poverty until his reinstatement, at which time he is assigned to the coast of England. And he becomes an active member of the community, spends a good number of evenings with something called the Headstrong Company at a local tavern where they eat, they drink, they repose, they do politics, and the White Hart Tavern is still there in the town is Lewis on the south coast, if any of you ever travel there. Paine, at this point, he's clearly what we might think of as a liberal. I mean, he's got liberal instincts, small L liberal instincts. He's not a radical. He's by no means a revolutionary, but he has a real power with words. And the excise officers' lives were very difficult. They were underpaid, and they really had tremendous expenses maintaining the horse with which they patrolled the coast. And his fellow excise officers recognized him as so good with words that they commission him, you might say, to write a petition, a plea to the government and the Excise Commission to raise the wages of the excise officers. Now, that's illegal. That basically is labor unionism of the 18th century. But nevertheless, he takes up the charge and he goes to London, which also means he's abandoned his post. And I assume his fellow excise officers tried to cover him, but the fact is he has left his post. He spends a year practically in London. This is in the early 1770s, trying to persuade the Excise Commission to raise the wages. At the same time, he is meeting very significant figures in London, and he becomes friends with Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was the very best known figure in the Atlantic world for his inventiveness, for his way with words, and he spends a lot of his time in London. We all identify him with Philadelphia. He probably spent more time in London than he had in Philadelphia, but he really does like his younger friend, Thomas Paine. The Excise Commission sacks Paine again, and now it's finished. Paine really does have to wonder what he's going to do with his life. And he goes to Franklin and asks basically the kind of question, should I go west? should I go to America? Now, Franklin at this time is recruiting Europeans who might offer something to the revolution. Yeah, get on a ship, go to America. Because in 1774, Americans have begun their rebellion. They've essentially kicked out, I mean, not, yeah, physically in many ways, they've kicked out the British authorities. Paine, this is really interesting. Paine is by no means a figure that Franklin thinks is going to go over and enter into some kind of combat. The man is already 37 years of age. But one can't help but imagine that Franklin sees a talented young activist, I say young, even though he's in his late 30s, who has a way with words. So Franklin persuades him to go and gives him a letter of introduction. Now, I want to point out at this point that Paine is about to arrive in a set of 13 colonies that are truly in rebellion. But this rebellion, even though they've basically kicked out the British authorities, by the way, this is an anarchist delight in America this time, because these American colonists have organized themselves into committees to regulate commerce and every other kind of activity in their towns and cities. So Paine arrives in America in late 1774. He lands in Philadelphia. He's not healthy at all. He's had a very, very difficult trip. He's suffered what they call ship's fever, probably typhus. And it takes him a while to recover. But when he comes to and he moves around Philadelphia, it's only a city of 1 square mile, 30,000 people. But he's astonished at how different it is than what he thinks of as the old world, England. Okay. He's shocked by the slavery that prevails in America. He's disturbed by the servitude, the indentured servants, but he can't get over the fact that inequality is far less, and even more significantly, the pluralism of nationalities and of religious groups in Philadelphia really does impress him. He has become overnight someone who celebrates America. And talk about amazing, his letter of introduction, to make the long story short, secures him the job as editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine, a new magazine. So he's gone from being this, what most historians and biographers call this failure, to being now a prominent citizen of Philadelphia. He's heading up a magazine that becomes the foremost magazine in the colonies. But don't forget, they are in rebellion. One of the things that we should point out at the time, sorry, Bhaskar, I'm going on, but I was trying to set the scene for the revolution. Is that okay by you, or do you want to cut in for?
Yeah, keep going. Keep going. This is good.
No, what's really fascinating about this in this moment is most historians refer to Edmund Burke as a friend of the American Revolution. He wasn't. He had a certain fear of what Americans were capable of doing. Think now, it's Burke, while Paine is in Philadelphia, becoming enamored of America, but at the same time, his very first major article in Philadelphia is a call for the abolition of slavery. And he doesn't do what so many white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of the day would have done. He doesn't say, send them back to Africa. He says, we have an obligation. He treats them as Americans. And he says, we have an obligation to be sure they become educated and are afforded some property. But while he's doing that, back in England, Edmund Burke, who's a member of Parliament and a leading philosopher of his age, he's actually scared. He's actually afraid of what's going on in America. And what really frightens him is the possibility that, given that Americans are in the state of rebellion, and that rebellion is Americans wanting to have their rights as Britons, as Englishmen recognized. They're not thinking independence. They're not thinking of anything we would think of as revolutionary. They are thinking about, they want their rights just as their British cousins have their rights. And the argument about no taxation without representation, it's hell, no legislation without representation. But of course, conservatives for generations like to say that it's all about taxes, and it ain't, okay? It's about a kind of democratic sense of representation. Now, of course, the English could care less, because only about 2 out of every 20 Englishmen had the right to vote because the property qualifications were so high. The Americans, however, had less inequality and a wider distribution of property. They wanted representation. But Burke recognizes something. This is something I only came upon 2 years ago, and I actually think it's fairly original what I'm going to say, okay? Burke recognizes that if the British Parliament seeks to suppress the rebellion, that the Americans might themselves realize that they're in a revolutionary moment, that this is not simply a rebellion, that this actually is a revolution. And Burke actually says, I won't bother to quote it, but I can tell you, he actually says, essentially, the Americans don't even realize they've already carried out a revolution. They've already carried out a he doesn't use the term democracy, it scared the hell out of people. Even further, he says they've already established in their own way a government from the bottom up. And he says, if we don't figure out a way to accommodate ourselves to it, he's willing to renegotiate the imperial relationship. If we don't find a way to accommodate ourselves to it, the American Revolution will take place in consciousness. The entire world will recognize it. And as a consequence, everything we hold dear, he's telling this to his fellow parliamentarians, will be threatened, if not overturned. So he recognizes the revolutionary possibilities before anyone, because conservatives have an ability to recognize threats more effectively than we recognize opportunities, is my thinking. Or as my friend Victor Kiernan, the British Marxist historian, used to say, they're usually in the driver's seat, which means they can see in front and in the rear view mirror. So Paine, that spring, in the wake of Lexington and Concord, April 19th, he becomes what we would think of with a capital P, a patriot. And he meets with Benjamin Rush, very prominent doctor, a member of the Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress. And Rush himself is something of a radical amongst the members of Congress. But Rush, like others, knows you don't talk about independence. You just don't do that. So he meets with Paine, and after some meetings, and probably consultations at the same time with members of the Congress, he persuades Paine to write a pamphlet calling for separation and a republic, which, by the way, Paine himself doesn't tell the story. Rush tells the story. And what's funny is Rush says, I told him, don't use two words. Don't use the word separation and don't use the word republic. Now, Paine had enough experience with rich people and prominent people to be very skeptical of all of them. And no doubt it occurred to him, and there's even a line in Common Sense which sort of expresses this. It occurs to him, he says, it's got to have occurred to him. What is he saying? How can I write about separation and a new government without talking about them and the words? Make the longer story short, that autumn, Paine leaves the magazine, commits himself with the help of Ben Franklin and others who give him documents to peruse. He is determined now to write a pamphlet calling not just for independence, but something that the members of the Continental Congress had, if they had known, they might not have wanted to unleash Paine. He's going to call, and he never uses the word, for democracy. In fact, Paine himself later says, if it had just been a matter of independence, it would not have been worth it. This really was the moment in which Americans needed to realize the power they had. I wanted to hold up something right now to show you. Basically, Paine wanted to hold up a mirror to Americans to say, look at what you're doing. Look at the power that you've literally possessed, that you've created already a kind of democratic government. And he calls for, indeed, he attacks the British system of government. He reminds Americans of the very possibilities of democracy. He reminds them, he doesn't remind them, he tells them, look, you're not British, you're American, and you're not fighting for the rights of Britons. In fact, you're not even fighting for the rights of Americans. You're fighting, and this is not his term, this is our 20th century kind of term, you're fighting for human rights. And in essence, he writes this pamphlet, Common Sense, which turns the rebellion into a revolutionary war.
So the initial rhetoric is more the natural born rights of Englishmen, right? Would be the traditional progressive rhetoric of that time, but Paine flips that into something more radical and more universalist, you could say, right?
Right. That's right.
And obviously, when he was writing for Pennsylvania Magazine, what was Amicus? What was his pen name?
Well, he used a variety of
yeah.
them. So, I mean, but go ahead.
But he was talking about, he has passages about how the British had stolen people from Africa to come cultivate the land they had stolen from the natives in America. So I mean, he obviously develops very early on these far-reaching views. But in Common Sense, I mean, I guess what makes Common Sense have this popular resonance? So obviously, the Democratic, Republican, more universal rhetoric has reached, but it has something like, you know better than me the population levels, but I think there's 2 million people, including the enslaved, in colonial America at the time.
3,500,000 of them are African American. The overwhelming majority of those would be slaves. The overwhelming majority of slaves are in the South, though slavery prevails throughout the 13 colonies.
So let's say freedmen 2.5 million or something in that range, and it sells what, like 150,000 copies,
right? 150,000 copies. You do the multiplication. What are we? 300 million people too. How many people?
330 now.
Okay, so do the multiplication and then multiply the number of copies. By the way, that was two things about that. First of all, Paine forswore the royalties. He said any royalties accumulated should go to buy mittens. That's the word, mittens for Washington's troops. Okay, he had no intention of accepting any royalties. The second thing is that newspapers throughout the colonies just literally excerpted and reprinted without permission. So probably the actual numbers were even greater. Now, you really have to imagine that artisans in the towns, laborers in the towns, because literacy was very high in America. It was probably the highest literacy in the world at that time. Farmers in the fields, they would, I mean, remember, it's a pre-electronic media age. People were reading it aloud to each other. It was not unusual for people to get up on a table in a tavern and read it aloud. So, and Paine, by the way, was never known as an orator, but the way in which he wrote it, because he loved poetry, the way in which he wrote it, he knew how it would land on the ears. So yeah, he wrote it, and he wrote it decidedly. Some historians have said in terms of the day, it was rather vulgar. The one thing to consider is this. Sorry if I'm getting too excited, but this is my childhood hero we're talking about, okay?
Well, you wrote the book on him, so this is, if I want to hear someone go on about Thomas Paine, it'd be you. So please keep going.
Okay, well, I'll just put it this way. There's a great little vignette that goes along with all of this. John Adams, no friend of democracy, right? But eager for independence, he bought 3 copies of Common Sense when it appeared in January 1776. 1 for himself, 2 he sent up to Abigail in Quincy, up near Boston, and with the instructions that she was supposed to share it with somebody else. And he sends it off, and he's waiting eagerly to hear what Abigail thinks. Now, we all know the line. Remember the ladies. It's like in every story of American feminism, a lot of them, it begins at that moment, you might say, as this prominent, the wife of a very prominent figure is already challenging the male hierarchy. But what's really interesting is this. There's actually exchange of letters, which we never hear about. And in this exchange of letters, sometimes they cross. Adams writes to Abigail and says, I'm waiting to hear what you think of this pamphlet. Abigail is sort of imagining, she's proud of her husband, she's imagining that perhaps John wrote this. And she says, basically, if you wrote this, and she says, remember the ladies, because if you don't, we're going to have to come down there and create our own revolution. And now what's interesting is that Adams writes back at a number of things, one of which he says, I'm not manly enough to have written this thing. And this kind of cute exchange between them. And he goes on and literally attacks Thomas Paine as, essentially as vulgar, as somebody who can tear things down but not build them up, which is to say that Adams was already afraid of Paine's pen, because, by the way, Paine had already in Common Sense laid out a constitution, a very democratic constitution for the 13 colonies to become a nation. Moreover, he actually calls in this constitution for what we would think of as a Bill of Rights. The most prominent element in the Bill of Rights was separation of church and state, keeping in mind my earlier reference. Now, so what happens is that he basically sees, Abigail getting carried away, and he writes back, which is very telling of what's going on through the colonies. And he says, "Not you too. We have already heard about the masters at the students at the colleges rising against their masters," meaning Harvard, Yale, William and Mary. "We've heard about slaves rebelling against their masters." That was reports out of Virginia and North Carolina. In other words, he literally lays out the whole social structure of America and reports how all those tensions and class conflicts of the colonial period are now emerged as a consequence of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And finally, he says, again, now we hear that the greatest tribe of all, by which he meant women, is prepared to carry out a revolution. So it's a great exchange, it reveals the degree to which even the more radical, if you like, of the founders were already worried about what Thomas Paine was unleashing. And it also reveals what he was, in fact, unleashing.
So in Common Sense itself, obviously, by its title alone, people can get the gist, but it was a text written without the adornment, without the kind of the Latin mixed in and whatever else one would expect of these texts. It was written in a way that your average literate American, and literacy, of course, was higher in the Americas than it was in the old world, would be able to read it. So I want you to go a little bit more if you have anything else to say in Common Sense, but then I want to move to his actual political actions at the time, particularly in Pennsylvania, where there was an attempt to put into practice a form of democratic Republican government that is, far more sweeping and far more radical than what we ended up in the United States, getting in the United States as a whole.
Yeah, well, I'll just point out that one of the ways in which he makes Common Sense so effective is he harnesses the Bible, he harnesses reason, he harnesses history. And I will tell you that every good radical through American history, and I'm exaggerating, but I can tell you that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the foremost feminist of her day and of the 19th century, and herself a free thinker, kept Thomas Paine's writings by her bedside, and many another radical throughout American history has. So I will leave it to all of you to pick up a copy of Common Sense and read into what I've just been saying. But Paine during the Revolution is both active at what we would call the national level. Okay, for a while he serves as the secretary to the Congress for Foreign Affairs questions. And by the way, at one point, he becomes America's first great whistleblower. Boy, we could spend days on this stuff. But it's also the case, as you were signaling, he actually was very, very important in Philadelphia. I mean, the working people of Philadelphia recognized Paine's, if you like, the value of his pen, and he was recruited into these circles, which called for a one-chamber state house, a universal manhood suffrage. In fact, the only thing that Paine is interesting, and some people try to hold it against him, is he said there was only one group of people who probably shouldn't have had the right to vote, and that was people who worked for the government, because he said the people who work for the government might too readily vote in their own interest. I mean, that was just a remark. So conservatives sometimes have used that, by the way, to say people on welfare shouldn't have the right to vote. Well, screw them, okay? The point was Paine did call for a universal manhood suffrage. And at times, it's very clear, if we get into his later work, that he is clearly a feminist. But I don't want to make it out that he's calling for women's right to vote at that moment. That's sometimes suggested. I'm not so sure he was, but it was universal manhood suffrage. I mean, it was a revolutionary idea of its day. Is that
so? At the conclusion of the American Revolution, when there's debates over what type of government should be formed, the way we're taught in schools is there's only two camps, right? there's the Federalists and there's the Anti-Federalists. There's a group of people that might have certain more democratic or at least Republican impulses, and there's a group of people who are would-be authoritarians, but the authoritarians have history on their side in that they're modernizers and centralizers. And you could see in the economic thought, for example, of a figure like Hamilton,
Right.
A lot of, as Christian Parenti argues in his book, like the prototypes of a developmental state and so on. So I guess I want you to talk about Paine's work at the time. Why am I blank? The public good is the public good.
The public good. Now,
public good, right? And this kind of a third way, if you will, of Paine that
not
was
to be
both
confused with the third way.
not to be confused with their third way. I'm so steeped in the utter failures of the left in the 20th century. When I think of the third way, I think of Eurocommunism or something, or Santiago Carrillo or something. Right. But a figure who was both advocating forms of centralization, but also advocating for radical democracy, if that's not a mischaracterization of that pamphlet and his other work at the time.
Public good itself is not necessarily radical democracy. That has to do with an argument. Paine all the way through really did want a strong federal system. He really did fear, with very good reason, that the Confederation would fall apart. That especially when you consider the difference between South and North, just for starters, and we know of the Civil War. I mean, Paine was hostile to slavery. Even there were places where he could have made more of an argument against slavery, but he knew that if he did, it might actually have led to the separation, even during the Revolution. So what it is in Public Good is a pamphlet in which he says, well, there are these territories out to the Northwest, and they should not be the property of Virginia, which eyed the West, or New York State or Pennsylvania. They should become the property of the United States. And of course, that was meant to be free territory. No slavery would go there. And that's an important feature of that, which Lincoln uses later in, I believe it's the Cooper Union Address of 1859-60 when he goes to New York. Well, yeah. But what's really becoming a part of Paine's thinking at this time is that whereas you get a guy like Hamilton, and Paine is not in the United States during the constitutional period. He has left the United States in 1787 to go, instructed by Franklin, to go back to London and Paris for the purpose of raising money. Paine wanted to build a bridge, an iron bridge. He wanted to unite the colonies north to south. And if you can all just put into your minds an image of the colonies and a map, you have all these rivers running into the Atlantic. And it was very difficult to move by road from north to south. If you're going to really travel, you had to go by boat along the coast. Paine said, you can't have a United States if they're not united. So he wanted to build an iron bridge in Philadelphia across the Schuylkill River as a model for bridges all along the East Coast. And he couldn't raise the money because there was no major bank to fund it, because it just wasn't the resources. So Franklin said, go back to Europe. Now, he carries with him this idea that America is indeed a model for the world. This is important to his thinking, that the American Revolution, for all of its faults and failings, is a model for revolution, because this was a model in his mind that was carried out by farmers, by artisans, by laborers, and he knew well enough the degree to which African Americans and other people of color in the North and slaves in the South, even when they had fought on the British side, had helped bring about what we would think of as independence and the Treaty of Paris. So all I can tell you is that when he goes to Europe, we move into another kind of moment in Paine's life, which I'm looking at the time, we just don't have we can't do it.
Well, I think it is useful to talk about. So he's at this point traveling between London and Paris. He obviously has no idea where the revolution is gonna start, but I guess it is important. Okay. Maybe let's just get to two more things throughout this, or three things, and one would be covering rights of man. Obviously, because that's in many ways his most important work. And
I don't think so. I think no common sense, no rights.
No rights of man, of course, of course. This is a tough debate. But you know, you're the expert. So we're talking about I think rights of man. It's useful maybe to just explain what was in it. Then very briefly his relationship to the French Revolution, which I know could be a separate talk onto itself.
Right.
Then after that, I think to wrap up, it'd be good for us to get to the changing reception of Paine in American political life.
Yeah.
And to what extent the unusual revival of Paine, at least in popular consciousness, was because a quote from Ronald Reagan and Glenn Beck and whatever else, and just that kind of, maybe that's overstating that part of his I think return to stature in the U.S. Obviously, you and many other historians on the left played a role as well. But I think that would be a good place to wrap up. So we do have time. We'll probably won't do a Q&A today, but maybe let's start with rights of men.
Okay. Well, the first thing is he's going back and forth between London and Paris. By the way, he's extremely well known both in England and in France. Don't forget that the British working class, at various times, Paine actually threatened, he was always writing the crisis papers, actually threatened to go back to start writing for a revolution in Britain. And working people and middle class people who did not have the rights that were now secured for white working and middle class people in America, they did not have that. And there was already this movement, this sort of democratic agitation in England, and Paine was the champion of that. And similarly in France, he was renowned because, let's not forget, we would not have had the revolution succeed to the extent that it did without the French alliance and all of these French soldiers who had come to America to fight the British. And they carried with them the ideas of common sense back to the French Revolution. In fact, I'm going to make an outrageous remark and tell you, no common sense, no French Revolution. Okay, but I just want to add one other thing. He's going back and forth, and there erupts, to make the longer story short, the revolution in France, the Bastille, the National Assembly. Paine is in England when this happens, and he's thrilled by it because he believes there will be another Republican country which can ally with the United States as a model to the world. Now, the British government they've been spying on him the whole time. They basically, they want to arrest him. And he escapes from London. And by the way, the man who warns him to get out of the country is in fact William Blake. Paine sails quickly across the channel to Calais. And when he arrives, he finds out there's this huge celebration on his arrival that he's been elected. He's been given honorary French citizenship and elected to the National Assembly. Now, again, there's a long story here, but the point is, it is in the course of the French Revolution, the many phases of it, that he becomes directly involved in writing a new constitution, an early constitution for France. He then reads an amazing book by Edmund Burke, who I've already told you was very much afraid of the American Revolution for the possibility it would incite a British Revolution. Now Burke is all the more convinced that with the American Revolution accomplished and the French Revolution underway, that the British social order, not just the political order, the entire social order, is in jeopardy. Paine, he writes Reflections on the Revolution in France. Paine responds, by the way, Mary Wollstonecraft responds as well, on the rights of women. He responds with rights of man. First, a defense of the revolution, which is very much based on the arguments of common sense. The second part of it that appears takes us further. He begins a real trajectory. He says, look, overthrow, end the monarchy and the aristocracy, the resources will enable us to do things on a public basis, to enable us to combat poverty. Now, that includes setting up employment offices. I mean, it really is the idea. He's moving very much in the direction of what we would call social democracy. And I'll just jump ahead and tell you that in a few years' time, he will write a pamphlet called Agrarian Justice. And in this pamphlet, he actually becomes the father of Social Security. He says, look, the landed rich, the landed class, he doesn't even refer to any particular nation state in this moment. The landed class holds the land that they hold basically immorally. God created the earth for all of us to share. So if some of us have more of it, they're holding it on an immoral basis. And thus, they have an obligation. He's not prepared to dispossess them, though one can read his argument as a threat. That is, we're going to give you an opportunity, basically, to take care of others. And if you don't, then you know what'll happen to you. And he says they owe a tax or a payment to the community, to the nation. That payment will go into a fund or a treasury. And in that treasury, you will then be able to do two things. Every young person, and here's the feminist in him, whether they are a man or a woman, male or female, whatever, okay? Every young person on reaching the age of maturity will be given a grant of money to start them in life. And they can use it for business, they can use it for land, they can use it for an education. The point is, it is theirs. And by the way, you could not turn it down. This is a really important lesson. Paine knew that if it was something that only went to the people who needed it, it would be viewed as a charity, and conservatives would try to take it away or say, well, we can't afford this charity anymore. The point was, everyone, when they reached the age of maturity, had to accept it. You could give it back, but you first had to accept it, which, by the way, is why don't buy into any argument to separate any kind of social program into those who need it and those who don't. Make it universal. But the other thing is that he said when men and women reach a certain age of maturity at the other end of the working life, they should be able to stop working, and they should be able to do so without going into poverty. It was meant that there should be old age pensions, public old age pensions, Social Security. Okay, and once again, you could not turn it down. You had to accept it. You could return it, but that was your doing. That was your donation, not the government's donation to you. Okay, this was his way of, if you like, cultivating what we know of as social democracy. And by the way, later, socialists grabbed hold of this. I'll just make one point, okay, before I finish my discourse here. In every single generation of American history, as much as conservatives tried to suppress his memory, and all of us historians, all of us who are biographers, we all thought Paine's memory had been suppressed. But in fact, it had not. In every generation, from the moment of the revolution thereafter, even religious groups that would not use Paine's name because he was a deist, grabbed hold of him, if they were progressive, and made him or his words their words, whether they were free. And by the way, free thinkers, abolitionists, feminists, socialists, populists, progressives, anarchists, communists, every single generation of progressives, regardless, laid hold of Thomas Paine's arguments and thereby laid hold of the revolution. And as Paine wrote, in 1782, when Congress offered him the chance to become the historian of Americans' revolution, he turned it down and said, it's too soon to write the history of the revolution.
Yeah, and this is a figure that was really, really honored by the 48ers, the revolutionaries fighting for democracy across Europe. Actually across the world in 1848, by the Chartists, by generations of labor organizers and agitators in the United States. So there was something there, something that resonated throughout these generations. And obviously, whenever there was an upsurge after that, it's been pretty bleak at times for the workers' movement in the U.S. From the 1930s to 1960s, Paine has reemerged. I think it's probably not necessary for us to get into the right's distortion of Paine, because you did such a great job laying out what he actually thought and advocated for. It would be kind of absurd to then say why Thomas Paine does not have much in common with Glenn Beck.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering whether you could end on a slightly broader point about the American Revolution as a whole. So we just went over a point that I think most socialists and radicals can agree with, which is that Thomas Paine represented the most emancipatory wing of the American Revolution, that he represented a real radical tradition within this country that was appreciated around the world and continues to inspire around the world. But when we think about the American Revolution that we actually did get, there's contesting views in the left, and I'm going to broadly bastardize them right now. And one would be the American Revolution was incomplete, but it created a framework imbued with a certain Enlightenment ideals that has allowed us to more deeply realize it in the future. The first American Revolution begets the second American Revolution of the Civil War and Reconstruction, begets the rights revolution of the 1960s, and helps lay the groundwork potentially for the third and hopefully much more far-reaching American Revolution that we aspire to in the future. And I would say that this is what figures like Eugene Debs, this is what the Communist Party militants in the 1930s thought, and so on.
Yeah, there's a line in Common Sense. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. I actually think it's the most revolutionary line in modern history. I mean, it's both utterly true and utterly false. I mean, we can never start with a clean slate, but it's also the case that we do have it in our power to transform the world. And by the way, I mean, we've all seen the arguments and heard the arguments by John Nichols and others that of Lincoln's ties to socialists, to Marx and others. Please understand, I can't connect Paine directly to Marx. I think if we look closely, we could do it. But I can tell you this. The 48ers, I can definitely tie Paine to. And the 48ers, many of them came to the United States. Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and even in rural areas, there were communities of 48ers who brought with them, because they had read Common Sense and Rights of Man, brought those ideas with them. And here's the thing, to the extent that there was a socialist movement derives from that idea, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And I think that the revolution is incomplete, but I'll throw back something else. You can't tell me a revolution that's complete. You can't tell me a revolution that actually accomplished its goals. The point is, the revolution is only, if you like, Marx once wrote in 1843, even before the early Marx that we all talked about. He actually said, the real struggle is to realize the dream that has always been a part of humanity.
I think that's a beautiful place to end it. We'll definitely love to have you on this channel again. There's a lot to cover. We could talk FDR. We could talk E.P. Thompson. We could go in a lot of different directions. So we'll hope to have you on soon. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Can I please just give one plug unrelated to this talk, which is, besides for liking and subscribing to this channel, our friend Ben Burgess, who appears at least once a week on this channel, has his own channel, and he's going to go live for this third episode at 7:30. I will be tuning in. Please check out Ben's work. He's a hustler in the best sense. He works his ass off, and he does it for basically free for your attention and for his political cause, which is the cause of socialism. And so check out his channel. Please look at Harvey's work. Take Hold of History Now. There's a host of other work that he's put out over the decades. One other thing. On this channel, we have we're normally broadcasting on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays with these live shows. This week, we're going to do a show on Thursday instead of Wednesday. and that's Lee Phillips and Christian Parenti having a probably a little bit contentious debate on nuclear energy and how it should fit into our visions of a Green New Deal and socialism. Can we go all renewable? Should we be pro or con or somewhere in between? I'm fairly agnostic on the topic. I think Lee and Christian they're both friends. They both like each other, but they're looking forward to a contentious debate on Thursday. Then on Friday, we'll have Lauren Bauhorn talking about the lost history of the anti-fascist movement in Germany, the real Antifa, or the original one, which was founded by socialists in the 1930s and 40s in Germany. Well, anyway, once again, thank you, Harvey. Thank you to Cale Brooks, our producer, and for everyone for tuning in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.